Hey everyone, this is the Black Manga Critic here with another video for my Fantastic Fridays playlist. Now, I've been trying to get my videos done on Friday, but Fridays tend to be a pretty busy day for me. So what may happen is that I may change the schedule to Saturdays because I just have more time. I'm not working on Saturdays, so then I have more time to get certain videos done. But I'm gonna stick to Fridays. Because I do think that I can get that done. I can get videos out on Fridays. It may not be super long videos like this one is going to be, but I can definitely get videos out on Friday. So continue to look out for videos on Fantastic Fridays. But today, I'm going to be putting out this video, which is going to be a compilation of the Vision Volumes 1 and 2, and I'm going to be doing a review and analysis of those two volumes in this one video. I would normally split volumes, but I do feel like that, because comic book trades and the volumes work so great as a cohesive whole, that I think that an analysis of, let's say, like Volume 2 is really hard to do without Volume 1. And that's especially true with the Vision comic. So Volume 1 does a really great job at getting to the core of what Tom King is trying to sort of answer, like a question that he's trying to answer, which is, what does it mean to be human? What is humanity? How do we define it? How do those definitions affect the decisions that we make and things of that nature? And so the first volume and the second volume as well, but the first volume is particularly sort of logical in certain ways and philosophical in the sense that we see that the ways in which sort of conversations and arguments happen are can be very calculated, right? And that's sort of something that Tom King is sort of interested in. Like, is sort of humanity defined by simply defined by arguments, or the way that we put together those arguments, the way that we frame those arguments, right? So when we enter the first volume, right, we see that we kind of quickly learn that Vision has a family, and he moved into rinky-dink suburbia, and then we're also almost immediately introduced to George and Nora, who are rinky-dink white suburban couple, right? And I want to say rinky-dink white problematic suburban couple, right? Because before they even get to the Vision's house, they're already arguing about the stupidest things, do the Visions eat cookies? What is that? What does it mean that because they don't eat cookies? Blah blah blah. Right? Nora's trying to show that she's as much of a sort of in a weird way, sort of allied to them, and she's not trying to be a problem, but in that sense, she's being a huge problem. And George he just doesn't care, right? He's a problem. But the way that their argument works, right, sort of shows a kind of basic framework for problem relationships, and maybe problem relationships within suburbia. But I think in general, that's just it's just problem relationships. Because you can always have a stupid argument anywhere, in any relationship. But I think what I love is how Tom King says, okay, I'm going to juxtapose that George and Nora, this couple, and their argument with Vision and Virginia and their argument, which is seemingly far more complex, right? In the way that it's structured, but at the core of it, it's another really stupid argument, right? It's just and Vision's kind of to blame for that, right? Because you're sort of who cares? What's the difference between she's very kind and she's very nice or whatever? Really? Is that an argument that's worth any salt? In between, with Vision and Virginia, and Virginia's clearly sort of thinking the way that I think and many other readers are thinking, right? Why are we having this argument? And even if we are having this argument, why can't you just take my side in seeing that it doesn't really matter? Because it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter, the semantics of being too, she seems kind and she seems nice. The semantics of that, don't really matter in, the grand scheme of their, relationship or anything like that. But it's the fact that Vision chooses to sort of tell her, to recommend her, right? To go and just go with the flow, right? Just kind of go with how he sees things. And I think in that sense, right, we see how at the core of these arguments actually is a very like problematic sort of misogyny that exists right throughout probably the United States, the world, really. You know, the United States is not the only country that has issues with misogyny, right? But at the core of both of those arguments is a sense of misogyny, which George and Vision are just like, hey, like, just go with what I'm thinking because, you know, I'm the man and I'm right and you're the woman and you're not supposed to question my lines of thought in this relationship and blah, 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 and all that other like patriarchal bullshit, right? So that's what's going on there. And I think Tom King does a fantastic job of laying that out and and sort of saying that like this is going to be something that is going to be an issue throughout Volume 1, right? So we also see that Vision has all these sort of like, I don't want to say trinkets because they're very important, but sort of gifts from various heroes, right? So he has the lighter that he got from Captain America, the old like 1943 lighter that he got from Captain America. He's got a flying vase from the Silver Surfer. That's very well known on Norrin Radd's home planet Zenn-La, right? So he has that. And he also has, which might be the most important item, but I think all three items are particularly important, right? And you'll see that later on in Volume 2. But the third item that's really important, that's pretty important, is the Everbloom plant that he received from Wanda Maximoff, from the Scarlet Witch, right? So all those three items, and we also see the Black Panther piano, and that's also important later on. But I think that in terms of the relationship dynamics between Virginia and Vision, those three items are like really, really important in a sense, right? So in Volume 1, right, we see that the vase is particularly important, sort of as like a motif that it reoccurs. You see it throughout the volume. It has different meanings in different situations, and in a general sense, right, like Tom King is really sort of, I think, like he's really sort of trying to show that the vase is, right, like multifaceted in its representation of the visions, right, in the sense that the vase is something that can't sustain like plant life, right, like, and many have questioned why that vase is useful in any way, right, but, right, and in the same sense, right, people understand that Vision has like saved the world, like, right, like as the Vision said, like 37 times, right, so people understand that Vision saved the world, but they probably also understand that, like, one, there are other heroes who also save the world, if like as many times, if not more times, and so there's a way in which like Vision sort of gets the short end of the stick in that sense because he's sort of not human in that sense, right? And we also see that, you know, the vase is similar to the Visions in the sense that like Virginia, Vin, and Viv are seen as objects more, right? Like they're seen as robots, they're seen as like inanimate, and not useful to the world outside of, you know, their family sort of dynamic, and even that is seen to be a problem or whatever, for whatever reason, right? People just have a problem with their family dynamic. I don't really understand it, but that's a thing. So we see that like the vase represents the Vision in a lot of ways, but we also sort of see that like the Vision, that the vase sort of recalls another, right, like Marvel hero, right? So the Silver Surfer, right? So in that sense, we also sort of like, if we're familiar with both the Vision and the Silver Surfer, then we can sort of say that like the vase connects the two sort of stories in a sense, right? The two ways in which like the Silver Surfer is sort of constantly searching for an answer to what it means to be human, what it means to be a sentient being, and all of those things, right? Like what's sort of like not necessarily the point of life, but like what does life sort of wholly have to offer, right? And the Vision is also always sort of trying to answer these questions. So in that way, the vase sort of connects the two, and their sort of quests in search of like what humanity should be defined as, and in that sense. If we're thinking about the lighter that Vision gets from Cap, we can also see that as sort of like right, like a motif, not in the same sense as the vase, because the lighter only really shows up like one other time in the first volume, I believe, and that's when, you know, there's going through renovations. The Visions are going through renovations in their house, and everything is kind of like gone to shit in a sense, right? And we see that George is looking for his dog, right? And we already know that like that dog's dead more or less, right? Like George's dog is dead, but the Vision's dog, right? That's going to be something that happens later on in the volume. But basically, like we understand that the dog is dead. George has come over, and Virginia, you know, and George have a conversation, right? And there's a real sort of interesting way in which, like, you know, George is sort of like fascinated with the lighter. He wonders why it still works after like, right, like I want to say like a good like, so like 74 years, I want to say. But we understand that the lighter is important, not only because right, he wonders, you know, like why it works and things like that, and we understand that later on in volume 2 that it's like, right, it's made of vibranium, so we understand that it's important. But I think in volume 1 and in that particular scene where George is sort of like, man, they don't make things like they don't make these things like they used to, and Virginia's like, no, they do not, right? At that instance, I think, one, we don't know that it's made of vibranium, but we do understand that, like, I think, at least for me, George is sort of saying that, like, he's, you know, he misses, like, an older time where, you know, things were sort of simpler, right? Like, women weren't trying to, like, you know, fight for all of the rights that they could get. Like, they weren't being a problem, right? Women were just kind of staying in their lane, right? And really, that's, like, and really it was just, like, you know, oppressive patriarchy, right? But he's just like, oh man, like, you know, times were so probably simpler, you know, very like simple, you know, I didn't have to deal with like, you know, crazy superheroes and things like that or whatever, and women like, you know, being outspoken and all of that blah 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 stuff, right? But Virginia's like, no, they don't make these things like they used to, right? And in that way, she's sort of saying like, one, that time's like in the past, like for the most part, right? Like the Stepford wife is not like, you know, the lauded over symbol for like for womanhood, right? Like that's not like a symbol anymore, like for that, like in a general sense, right? You know, things have changed, right? In a lot of ways, and in that way, that conversation is a sort of another way that Tom King sort of, like, I think very subtly sort of saying, like, hey, like, times are, you know, different. Like, women's rights is, like, a huge, like, movement. And you, George, have to deal with it, right? So I thought that was, like, really, really subtle writing. At least for me, like, that's how I read it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. But I do think that, like, the way that I see it, like, it's a very subtle way to sort of say, like, okay, like, this volume, like, won't only be about, like, what does it mean to be human, but, like, what does it mean to be, to not only be a woman, but, like, a synthezoid, I believe, is, like, a synthezoid woman who is, like, reviled by, like, most of, like, the people that she knows, right? Like, so, like, times for Virginia are, like, really hard. And I also think that, like, what was the third thing? Right, like the Everbloom tree is also a really important sort of object, right? Because the first time we're sort of introduced to it, we see that Virginia is just like, you know, almost like intensely quiet, right? I think that's what they say, like it's a sort of an intense quiet that sort of Virginia sort of like falls into. And that's important because, like, you know, clearly, like, Virginia sort of recognizes that there's a connection between, right, the Everbloom plant, the Vision, and the Scarlet Witch, right, and their relationship and what happened and everything like that, and that, like, intense love that they have for one another, and I think they still have for one another, right? So that's really important because it sort of says that, like, the Vision decided to, right, like, not only keep, like, these sort of, like, relics of, like, of the past in a sense, right? Because he like all these objects were given to him, right? So like those objects represent like past instances and connections to like his fellow heroes. But this tree in particular also represents like the fact that their marriage is kind of not broken, but it's sort of inherently broken. It's sort of like, right, like if you're in a relationship, let's say like if it's like me and like I like, you know, like let's say like right, like with my fiance, like let's say like I like get like I don't know, like a painting from like that my ex gave me like for a gift or something like that. Like I'm not gonna take that painting and like put it in our bedroom. Like that's crazy. You know what I mean? Like the only thing that I can think of that's like sort of close to that is like if you've ever read Toni Morrison's Jazz, there's a point where the two sort of like protagonists, right, the couple, they like their marriage is like pretty like screwed up, right? Because I want to say Violet's husband, right, cheated on her, right, with like a teenager basically, and her picture is like sitting like on their sort of fireplace or whatever, you know, just like not mocking them, but like really like ruining their relationship like every second that it's there. And Morrison's really like great about like, you know, using motifs and very powerfully. And I think that tree sort of works in a similar way, right? It's like if you keep something in the house that's a sort of relic of a past relationship and one that was pretty important to you, like that's crazy. Like that's crazy for the current relationship. That's just not going to work. You know, so I thought that was like really sort of fantastic in a sense that it just, you know, it's a motif that like continues to sort of creep through the narrative in volume 1 and also like in volume 2, right? It ends up being very important in a sense that we know the tree allows you to tell the future, and you know, Agatha Harkness and Wanda have like seen the future and blah blah blah. So we get that, we already know that. But I think in a general sense, it's really important that you have these three objects acting as like potent motifs, right? That just work, right? They work in the way that, you know, Tom King is trying to sort of answer questions about like what does it mean to be human, right? And I think like in that sense, like in one sense, like for Vision and me, like those objects. And Virginia, and pretty much anyone else that comes into contact with them, both in Volume 1 and Volume 2, it means that like humanity sort of is encapsulated through like you're right, like your interactions with other people, with other living things, and that in that sense, right? So like if Vision just sort of like lived in a vacuum, right, and sort of in a way that like I want to say like Ultron in a sense, right? Like when he was created. You know, just kind of like in a vacuum in a sense, right? Like in that sort of like instance, like before anyone sort of like responds to him or anything like that, and he hasn't learned anything yet. You know, like so I thought that those three motifs work really well in Volume 1, and they do work really well in Volume 2 later on. But I'm going to talk about that. I'm not going to talk about that now because I'm still sort of talking about Volume 1. Actually, I think and in terms of Volume 1, like death is really, really interesting, right? Because like as a concept, in the sense that in the way that Virginia is like really grappling with it, right? Because I think that like, you know, if we sort of want to talk about both Volumes 1 and 2, like Vision sort of consistently like repeats like mistakes, right? Like he doesn't seem to particularly learn in the way that like Virginia clearly wants him to learn, in the way that I think the Avengers like also like want him to learn, right? And you know, like Virginia is just like, okay, like I've been doing all of these things, and Virginia's clearly been doing all these things not only to sort of protect herself in a sense, but more so to protect her family, right? Because like we understand that like, you know, all of these deaths in the neighborhood would clearly like affect their family dynamic. They wouldn't be able to stay in the neighborhood. Vision wouldn't be able to continue his sort of quest towards humanity in a sense, right? Like his children wouldn't be able to do that. Viv and Vin, right? So that's like a really great, like King does a really great job of sort of saying that like what it means to be human has to involve like questions about death and mortality, and how you can sort of choose to deal with those questions, right? So I think that like Virginia, like in Volume 1, is probably like the most like well sort of fleshed out character. Just like Vision's like, you know, he's pretty cool too. Like I think he does sort of like cool things with Vision, but I think that like when you like what we see sort of in Volume 2 and the way that sort of Volume 2 ends, that like Vision is sort of constantly like repeating transgression after transgression after transgression, and in some ways like that, like for Vision, that's like he sort of encapsulates that sort of part of humanity, and like, and maybe even defines humanity in a sense. Like we're constantly making mistakes, you know. Sometimes like no one like doesn't make the same mistake twice, right? You know, so I think that like in that sense, like like Vision sort of encapsulates humans and their sort of inability to like not make mistakes, right? To constantly like trip up. And Virginia sort of like represents like humanity's like attempts to stop themselves from tripping up, right? Like that ability to sort of say like, oh man, like you know, like I don't want to say murder is like a mistake or anything. Well, I mean murder is like, it's a huge mistake, but like, you know, I don't want to like simplify it in that sense, but I do think that like Virginia like consistently like killing people and certain things, right? Like is a way in which Tom King sort of says that like Virginia's journey to figure out what humanity should be defined as for herself is going to be very morbid and bloody and visceral. So Volume 2 is really wonderful because like, right, like those questions of death and what it means to be human and right, like what is humanity, are like, you know, ramped up to like 11, right? And in Volume 1, I would say it was ramped up to like a 9 or an 8, like an 8, and then it was like ramped up to like 11 or 12, right? Right. Both Vision, the Vision's son, and Virginia die in Volume 2, right? And Volume 2 is the conclusion of the story, but like those two deaths are so impactful, right? Because they really sort of force like readers to question, like not to question necessarily, like it forced like Vin's death forces Virginia to question and Vision to question like the worth of humanity, right? Like of like being human, like because of like all of the feelings and like the regret and the pain that comes with that via the death of like loved ones, right? But I think also like it forces readers to really think about like, you know, in those situations like what, like how have you thought, like what would you have done, you know, if you were someone who was like, you know, superhuman and could like take out, you know, the Avengers like by yourself, you know what I mean? Like if your son or daughter or child, right, like had been murdered, right? So that I think is really well done by King, because like he also sort of like incorporates the objects into these like questions of like death and, you know, what would you do and how would you sort of like try to maintain your humanity or give it up, right? So Virginia's like path is really interesting because she's just like, you know, she's still like descending, right? She was already descending into like some sort of like madness, right? Like and I'm quoting that from the comic. I can't remember who says it, but a character does say it. I feel like maybe it was Scarlet Witch or something like that. But we do see that like Virginia is just like slowly spiraling down into the depths of like a dark like pit, right? And Virginia decides that like, okay, like I have taken upon myself as the matriarch of the family to maintain any sort of semblance of humanity that we have left following like the events of Volume 1, right? Because like at that point, like everyone's just like, oh, like we gotta like, you know, deal with like the Visions, like they've like clearly like gone off the rails, blah, blah. And this is what people think. I just think that like they're trying to maintain semblances of humanity, right? That's constantly what like Vision's constantly trying to do that. Virginia's constantly trying to do that. Viv is constantly trying to do that, you know, like through prayer and things like that. You know, and Vin like is trying to do that through like his love of like literature and acting and those and theater, right? So when Virginia's son, when Vin does pass away, right, it's a huge blow to Virginia because she's already spiraling, and this only causes her to spiral downwards, like at a quicker pace, right? So at this point in the volume, we're just trying to figure out like who's going to just like really, 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 you know, go off the deep end and commit like a super like grievous and heinous act first. And it's really interesting because like King is sort of King does a really great job of sort of saying that like, hey, like we're as readers, we're thinking that the Vision is clearly going to be the one to like avenge, right? Like, because he's an Avenger, right? So he's supposed to avenge his son, right? Right. So we get that, and we think, okay, he's definitely going to do it because like we've already seen that like King has depicted him as like having no interest in like sort of maintaining his humanity or anything like in outside of revenge, right? Like outside of avenging. So he just beats down the Avengers. He does all this stuff, and like the most like impactful thing I think like about this volume is, you know, right, like is Virginia saying that like I need to maintain this person's humanity because I think I've already lost it. And I think like if Virginia clearly thought that like she hadn't like lost like her like sense of like what it means to be human, or if she hadn't lost like, or if she didn't think that she lost her humanity card, right, or whatever, right, then I think she wouldn't have like committed to like suicide in this story, right? Like I think that like the story would have went a different way, and she would have sort of like just continued to try to protect her family. But on the other hand, right, like I do think that like she understood that like her suicide was the only way that she could really protect her family at that point, because she sort of realized like, okay, like I have to put all of the sort of like pain and devastation and like, right, like governmental interference and you know, and those things, and like that's going to sort of like and on the governmental power, right, that's going to come on me, on my family, onto myself, you know. So it's a really like her suicide is like a very powerful act in that way. But I think that like what's sort of also important, right, is that like even with that act, even with that really powerful act, Vision like just transgress like the same transgressions. Like he just keeps on keeping on with just not ridiculous moves, because I think that like you know, right, like you sort of understand why he's making these why he's continuing to make these same mistakes, right? Because like he's human, right? Like I mean, like I think at the end of the day, right, and at the end of this volume, like we understand that like Vision is very much so like a human, right? Like he's right, like he's obsessed, like he's connected, like he loves, right? He has all of these like human like feelings, right, and emotions and connections, and that though like his humanity, right, is what causes him to consistently make mistakes, right? So we understand that, but it's also like sort of like, you know, sad in a sense, because we understand that Virginia's sacrifice, self-sacrifice, right, like is intended to, right, like change Vision in a way, right, like in a way that like is positive for him. But even though he's taking care of Viv at the end and all that stuff, and you know, he cares about her and he's trying to sort of maintain some semblance of humanity, like he's rebuilding, right, like another wife, right, another partner, and he's probably going to rebuild you know, another son, right? Because like I mean, like if like why would he stop at building another wife, right? He could just, you know, continue to go on and on, you know, until the end of time or whatever. But I do think that like King does a really great job of sort of saying that like, hey, like you can't like one person can't encompass what it means to be human. Just like right, like you can encompass like ideas of human, or ways of being human or anything or anything like that, but like because one person can't sort of encapsulate that, right? Because like I said sort of in the beginning of the video, humanity is very much so like interactions with other people, right? Like humanity doesn't exist in a vacuum in a sense, but like one person in a vacuum doesn't sort of like represent humanity in like all of its sort of glory, right? It's all about like how everyone sort of interacts with one another, how everyone sort of improves themselves because of those interactions, those memories, past events, things like that. And so, like, you know, Virginia and Vision are symbols of humanity, right? In that sense, right? Like Virginia is like a symbol of like how quickly like humans can sort of descend into darkness. How humans like constantly question what it means like to be who they are, right? And love, right? Like, I mean, both Vision and Virginia represent love, but I think Virginia like definitely represents love. You know, and she also represents like self-sacrifice, like, right? Like that sort of altruistic nature that I think does exist. I think there are a lot of like philosophical sort of things that sort of say like, oh, well, you know, people can't be altruistic, but I think they do. Like, I think that altruism is a thing. It does happen, rarely, but it does happen, right? And Virginia is like a clear like sign of like just saying like, I am doing this so that my family can be okay after like my death, right? I'm trying to think like of another thing in Volume 2 that I really like. I guess like the relationship between like Scarlet Witch and Vision was pretty cool, in a sense that like you know, like it's possible, like, right, like the fact that they have a relationship, right, I think is probably the first like sign that like Vision is human, right? Because he can love, and he like it's an intense love, right? Like they both really love each other, and I think that like the loss of Wanda really sort of like threw him off, you know, so like off a cliff, really, because like all those mistakes that he's making, I think like right like stemmed from the loss of that initial love that he had for Wanda, right? So I think in that, like in a general sense, like right, like in both volumes 1 and 2, like that's something that totally colors the volumes. So I guess like that's sort of all I wanted to talk about, because I don't want this video to be like a crazy long review or anything like that. I don't want this video to be like an hour or an hour and a half, because it could easily be that. You know what I mean? Like I could go on and on and on about volumes 1 and 2, but I just sort of wanted to talk about like the things that I thought like were really important to me. You know, because like, you know, you guys can, you know, tell me if you saw particular things that you thought were really important. You know, like the dog's death by Virginia's hands was really important. I'm not gonna talk about that in this video because that would have like encompassed too much, right? Like Cap's lighter as a sort of like symbol of Vision's like ability to get out of his house, like, you know what I mean? Like stuff like that. Like I can talk about all day, but I'm not gonna talk about this. I'm sort of end the video here. Remember, like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what else you want me to review. You know, in terms of like the volumes, like rankings, like this was definitely like a I want to say like a 4 out of 5. Like it was a really great story, really well done. You know, it's an intense story, and there's not a lot of like wiggle room for like fun, right? Like light in a sense. And so like, you know, I'm not gonna give it a 5 out of 5 because like, you know, I need some light in my life. So I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5. Again, like remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to be notified of more content, find me on Twitter using the link below at the Manga Scholar. And this is the Black Manga Critic signing off.